Stanton Friedman is probably maybe the only person in the field who could justify the term legend. I don't know. And there were a couple others, I think, but they've passed on. So, they're sort of posthumous legends. And, when you've passed on, this legend thing, it's like, okay, it's legend, but, to be a real legend, you got to be around, right? If you're gone, there are people who've been gone for hundreds of years. Sure, they're legends. Who cares, right? Stanton's still around. He received his BS degree and his MSc degree in physics from the University of Chicago. I have a degree in physics from Eckerd College. Eckerd College is never confused with the University of Chicago. And this is back in 55 and 56. This was about 10 years after I was born. He was employed for 14 years as a nuclear physicist with such companies as GE, GM, Westinghouse, TR. This is before they all bought the networks and all the radio stations and everything and got into the business of telling us the truth, or what they think it is. Aerojet General Nucleonics and McDonnell Douglas. There are a lot of people that have had these kinds of backgrounds, by the way, okay, working in physics and these kinds of companies and so forth, and the government says that these people have no clue as to what's going on. It's all an illusion. Fascinating. Since 1967, he's lectured on the topics flying saucers are real in more than 600 colleges and over 100 professional groups in 50 states and 9 provinces, 13 countries. I've been trying to crack the college circuit for 7 years. No luck. He's been doing it for 20. He has published more than 80 UFO papers and appeared on hundreds of radio and TV programs. He is the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident and co-authored Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident. Top Secret Magic, his explosive book about the Majestic 12 group, established in 47 to deal with crash saucers, was published in 1996 and is in 6th printing. Stan was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award at Leeds, which sadly is no more. And I hope, in a sense, that the X Conference perhaps is taking up the mantle of Leeds and will help to replace that hole in this field. And he got that award in September 2002 by UFO Magazine of the UK, also gone now. But Bill Burns is trying to resurrect it. A documentary, Stanton Friedman is Real, was broadcast in Canada in 1902. I like that.
1902?
2002. See, once again, you thought that was a mistake, didn't you? Yeah, you were wrong. Look, the fact is, I may end up, well, the fact is, everybody has a favorite quote of Oscar Wilde. I've got several, but we've all got at least one. One of the ones that is particularly important and profound, some of you may have it as your favorite, is this. If you're going to tell people the truth, you had better make them laugh or they will kill you. Oscar Wilde. Stanton has been trying.
He's dead. See what it got him?
No, they put him in prison and he died shortly thereafter. But I digress. The point is, I think Oscar did tell the truth, and I think they did kill him, as a matter of fact. Of course, he had an incredible hubris. The point is that Stan's been telling the truth for a long time. He's still around. Why? Because he's got a great attitude. He knows how to make even his harshest enemies laugh. He knows how to make a point. He knows how to do a one-liner. He knows how to get stuff across, And he makes you feel good, even though he's telling you something you don't believe. That's not easy to do. There's a lot of people out there that never master it. They want to tell you something that you don't believe is true, and they drive you crazy doing it. Not Stanton. That's one of the reasons why he's been around so long, why he's a rock, why he's a legend. He had to be here at the X Conference. It wasn't even close, all right? In fact, he has a standing invitation to every X Conference from now on. But today, he's yours. So, an hour and a half with Stanton Friedman. Not bad?
Thank you. Hey, here's the man who put it all together. He deserves our thanks. It's been one hell of a job. And I should add, I've been lecturing at colleges for 37 years. What is this 20-year routine? The title, in case you didn't know it, which you would only know if you went to the 17-page description of the whole conference, is Debunking the Debunkers. A Debunking the Debunking lecture, when it comes to flying saucers, if you wanted to be inclusive, you could do a whole thesis on that at some university, because there's so much bunk out there. It's truly incredible. Bunk which is bought by the media and by the scientific community, which hasn't been doing its job, neither one, for the last 57 years. I have to start all my lectures with a statement of where I'm coming from. I don't mean New Brunswick, but that's another story. 4 major conclusions after 46 years of study and investigation. One, the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. That means some, underlined 22 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. I don't care about them. Second conclusion, the subject of flying saucers represents a kind of cosmic Watergate. That doesn't mean everybody in the government knows what's going on. That's not how you keep secrets. I worked on more canceled government-sponsored classified advanced research and development programs than anybody. I learned how to keep secrets. You don't do it by telling everybody. So some few people have known since 1947, when 2 crashed flying saucers were recovered with alien bodies in New Mexico, that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft. The third conclusion is that none of the objections raised by a small group of very noisy negativists, people like my University of Chicago classmate for 3 years, Carl Sagan, stand up under careful scrutiny. They all sound splendid until you look at the evidence, and then they collapse because they don't have any weight to hold them up. And finally, fourth, because I'm obviously such a shy, retiring kind of guy, we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium: visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, bodies, and wreckage for 57 years. I have to learn to change that number every year, you understand. But okay, so that's where I'm coming from. I am not an apologist ufologist. I am not a closet ufologist. I try to tell it like it is. And so today what I'll try to do is to debunk the debunkers. And I put some classic quotes from real UFO experts. If I'm lucky, it works. Yeah, it works. Okay. You will find these interesting. I mean, if you want to know about an important subject, you go to the experts. Here's Carl Sagan. The reliable cases are uninteresting, and the interesting cases are unreliable. Unfortunately, there are no cases that are both reliable and interesting. He said that in Other Worlds. 2, another great expert, Dr. Isaac Asimov. I hope you all remember who Carl Sagan was and Isaac Asimov and stuff. I was in a college class and they didn't know who Carl Sagan was recently. That was disappointing. Almost every sighting is either a mistake or a hoax. These reports are so riddled with hoaxes, and the flying saucer enthusiasts have so many cranks, freaks, and nuts among them that Hynek is constantly running, J. Allen Hynek, who was Air Force consultant on UFOs for 20-some years, is constantly running the risk of innocently damaging his reputation by being confused with them. That's dear old Isaac Asimov, who's written over 300 books, one on every subject you can imagine. Unfortunately, when he talks about UFOs, it's something he doesn't know anything about. What is this that's in the way here? 3, from Dr. Donald Menzel. Now, he's an interesting man, and we'll get into his interesting, but this was in Physics Today. All non-explained sightings are from poor observers. Well, this one from a science fiction writer, Ben Bova, he's still alive. These guys are all dead. The unexplained sightings are simply those for which there is too little information to provide a solid factual basis for an explanation. Ben Bova, he was then editor of Analog. He's moved on, but he's still doing science fiction stuff. And one of my favorites, of course, was from no less an authority than the Secretary of the United States Air Force, Donald Quarles. Quote, on the basis of this study, speaking about Project Blue Book Special Report 14, although he didn't have guts enough to give the title of the report, because then some newsman would have said, what do you mean 14? We've never heard of 1 through 13. What happened to them? He would have to have said they're still classified, and so he didn't want to say that, so he didn't give the title. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. I feel certain that even the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been obtained. Donald Quarles said that he was Secretary of the Air Force, said it in 1955. It set the tone for almost 50 years of massive misrepresentation on the part of both the Air Force and the press. Now, what these quotes have in common is none of the quotes are supported by data or references. All are demonstrably false. And we'll go into the reasons for saying that in a few minutes. I'll show you the data. Now, well, keep those in mind. they're almost as bad as some of these silly quotes. These relate to Roswell as it happens. Well, yeah, except for the last one. I'm trying to give you some flavor, you see, for debunkdom. In 1978, an article appeared in a tabloid newspaper, the National Enquirer, spelt wrong, incidentally, that's why the sick there, which reported the former intelligence officer Marcel, that's Jesse Marcel, claimed that he had recovered UFO debris near Roswell in 1947. You see, we've just tabloidized that. How would it get into the National Enquirer unless Marcel would go running to them, hey, I saw something, I saw something. Also in 1978, a UFO researcher, Stanton Friedman, nuclear physicist, he dare not say, you understand, met with Marcel and began investigating the claim that the material Marcel handled was from a crashed UFO. That's United States Air Force Colonel Richard Weaver in the big, fat, monstrous Roswell report, size of a New York phone book, you know. Now, just for the record, incidentally, the article appeared in 1980 after Bill Moore and I had already talked to 62 people in conjunction with Roswell. That's when the first book came out, was 1980. And I know about the National Enquirer because I was the one who gave Marcel's contact information to Robert Pratt, who's still alive and has written many excellent articles about a lot of subjects, but especially flying saucers. And Marcel didn't go running to anybody. And the further implication, of course, is that I get my leads from the National Enquirer, when in fact I was the one who gave the Enquirer the lead because the book was in the works. And I didn't meet with Marcel, actually. I talked to him on the phone, but I didn't meet with him until '79. But aside from that, it was all true. His specialty, I found out from somebody else who was in the Air Force, was disinformation. Not surprising, is it? Speaking about the debris, Colonel Sheridan Cavett, who for 20 years had sort of said, well, I wasn't really there and I don't remember anything and so forth. But when the Air Force comes calling, he's got to give him a story. Colonel Weaver came to see him, and here's what he said. The area of this debris was very small, about 20 feet square, and the material was spread on the ground. But there was no gouge or crater or other obvious sign of impact. I remember recognizing this material as being consistent with a weather balloon. We gathered up some of this material which would easily fit into one vehicle. Colonel Sheridan Cavett was lying through his teeth. The area of the debris was like 3/4 of a mile long and a few hundred feet wide. And if it would easily fit in one vehicle, why did the rancher take a little bit of stuff into town and then Jesse Marcel and Cavett had to go back with him? If it would easily fit in one vehicle, he would have brought it and said, hey guys, here's your saucer, where's my reward? He left most of it out there, lying through his teeth. He knew he was supposed to say weather balloon. He forgot that it was supposed to be a Mogul balloon, which is 23 balloons at 20-foot intervals hung together with string, with sono buoys and other things, which nobody ever mentioned ever finding out there. Isn't that amazing? So they lied. Now here's from a historian, Dr. Robert Allen Goldberg, a book, Enemies Within. He's got a whole chapter on Roswell, loaded with footnotes. Makes it, accurate, right? He did talk to me on the phone. The Roswell newspaper accounts are the only shards of physical evidence that exist to document these happenings. Gee, you'd think it never appeared in another newspaper. Al Franken said that on a really stupid show on television. I think they cut that part out, fortunately, with Richard Belzer. How come it only appeared in the Roswell paper? It must not have been a big story. Well, I will show you Los Angeles, Chicago, whatever. Only shards of physical evidence? He's a historian. He said a lot of other stupid things, and we'll come to those as we go along. Now, here's amateur psychiatrist from Brandeis University. Jesse Marcel had, for purely psychological rewards, related his tale to his friends, some of whom were UFO buffs, before he came to the attention of literary traditors. Can't say writers, you understand. We got to be a traditor. As his notoriety grew, he gave his story to the National Enquirer, a tabloid that admittedly pays its informants. Has anybody ever established that Marcel got paid by the National Enquirer? No. Had he shared it with UFO buffs? No. Did he come running to me with this story? No. How did I get the story? I happened to be at a television station in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, promoting a lecture I was giving that night at Louisiana State University. And I was supposed to do 3 interviews. I did the first 2, and the third reporter was nowhere to be found. And they didn't have cell phones back then, and the station manager was giving me coffee, looking at his watch. He knew the person who brought me to the station. He knew he had other things to do. And he's being apologetic. And out of the blue, he says, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And since I'm such a brilliant researcher, I naturally said, who the heck is he? Oh, well, he handled pieces of the wreckage of one of these flying saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. What? I picked my teeth up off the floor. What do you know about him? He lives over in Houma. That didn't help me. I didn't know where Houma was. He's a great guy. We're old ham radio buddies. You really ought to talk to him. Then the reporter showed up. If there hadn't been that gap, you'd have never heard of Roswell. I was busy the rest of the day. The next day I called information, got Jesse's number over in Houma. I did go there later on. And in my movie UFOs Are Real, I think I have a couple of copies left. That was done in '79. We interviewed Jesse in Houma, at his home. In his home in Houma. That's got a good sound to it. And he told me his story, but he didn't remember the date. Real surprising, after 47 to 77, that was 78 actually, he didn't remember the exact date. And I heard another story up in Bemidji, Minnesota at a college, Bemidji State College. Now it's a university. We got to be careful what we say here. And after my lecture, a couple that had gone out came back. We had a packed house. And ever hear anything about a crashed saucer in New Mexico? Well, yes, tell me more. And their good friend Barney Barnett had stumbled across a saucer. He worked for the government as Soil Conservation Service. I got their name and stuff so I could pass it on to Bill Moore the very next day I was seeing him. Minnesota's a funny state. The next day I gave lectures at 2 places, Thief River Falls and Crookston. And you wonder about that one, And, but I got their name and address so he could follow up on it. And we did get the date. And incidentally, to finish the story really of how it all began, Bill had a third story, an English actor named Huey Green, and I talked to him once when I was in England. He's dead now. In one of the first issues of Flying Saucer Review in the 50s, told how he was driving across the United States from Los Angeles to Philadelphia and heard the story on the radio about a crashed saucer in New Mexico and expected a big deal when they got to Philadelphia, and there was nothing. Well, he could pin down the date pretty close because it wasn't a trip you made very often, if you can imagine what the roads were like back then. Late June, early July 1947, his son lived in Canada and Bill talked to him. And so Bill went to the University of Minnesota Library, and I'm telling you this for a reason. Started looking through the periodicals. There's the story. It gave us a chance to independently verify what Jesse had told us and gave us the names of other people who were involved. I mean, they misspelled some of the names 4 different ways and all that sort of thing, but that's what got us rolling, and by 1980 we talked to 62 people. Before CD-ROM phone books. It was a lot of work. So did they come running to us? No. Did it happen by accident? Well, it's what happens when you're prepared. We followed up on it. Then I made a movie, UFOs Are Real. We visited Jesse, I visited him, and the rest is sort of history. But it wasn't the National Enquirer giving me a lead, and that article didn't appear, as I say, until 1980. And this implication, this nastiness, his notoriety grew. I gave his story to the Enquirer, and of course they admittedly pay its informants. Well, they didn't pay me, and as far as I know, they didn't pay him either. Now, the last one is great, same book. He's also from Brandeis, Dr. Charles Ziegler. Friedman, that's me. There are 2 Nobel Prize winners that are named Friedman, spelled that way. I'm not one of them, so sorry. Friedman states, he gives a quote, "I am convinced that the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled vehicles whose origin is off the Earth. In other words, some UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft." It's an accurate quote. I love his next line. This last sentence is the very definition of a true believer. Since when does a true believer talk about evidence? I have a real problem with that. What do you need evidence for if you're a true believer? Let's look at the next slide. Oh, some nonsense from Philip Klass. I mean, how could a Debunking the Debunkers not get into class? It is important to emphasize, he was talking about the CIA memos. We went to court, and I'll be talking about this in more details tomorrow. We went to court with the CIA. We want all your UFO stuff. We don't have any UFO stuff. Go away. You do too. We do not. We appeal. They deny. We go to court. The judge says do a search. They come back to court having said they had nothing. Yeah, we found 950 pages of UFO stuff. And oh yeah, here's a list of 59 other documents that we can't release because they come from other agencies. None of what they released was above secret, incidentally. And so he says, it is important to emphasize that these internal CIA memoranda, many of them originally classified secret, were written roughly 20 years before Congress passed the Freedom of Information Act, which would result in their being made public. They provide incontrovertible evidence that if one or more crash sources and ET bodies were recovered from New Mexico in 1947, word of this historic event had not been reported to top CIA officials or President Truman as of mid-1952. Now, what kind of nonsense? That's a polite word. I can say that. Since when can you talk about top secret matters in a secret document? The simple answer is you can't. You can't refer to higher level material and lower level material. If it's top secret code word, you can't talk about it in plain top secret stuff. This is intuitively obvious to anybody who thinks about it for 30 seconds, but not to Phil. And he was really referring mostly to confidential documents. See, they didn't say anything about Roswell here. It must not have happened. Where's the, there's no sense there. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. Now, you remember those statements about no sightings that are reliable and are interesting both? Well, the biggest bunk, of course, has been put out by the Air Force, seconded by the members of the scientific and science fiction communities. Odd combination there, incidentally. I went into a science fiction bookstore in Berkeley once. Where's your UFO materials? We don't carry any of that garbage, which I thought was an interesting attitude. I did a paper on science fiction, science, and UFOs, and I go into depth into what dear old Asimov said, and Bova, and Arthur C. Clarke, the ABC of science fiction. And boy, did they demonstrate their ignorance. Anyway, this is the cover of a privately published version of the largest study of flying saucers ever done that we know about anyway, unclassified. Done for the Air Force by Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio. They looked at 3,201 cases. They did quality evaluations, cross comparisons, categorizations of everything. They're drowning me out. They put this all together in a big fat report, Project Blue Book Special Report 14, but they didn't call it that. And I quoted to you what the Secretary of the Air Force said about this study. Remember, even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena if more complete observational data had been available. That's what he said. He lied. Let's look at the next slide, please. Here's the categorization of 3,201 sightings. You'll notice psychological, really there should be another word here, psychological aberrations. A polite way of saying crackpot cases. 1.5%. The American Physical Society says 2% of the papers submitted to it by physicists are crackpot papers. That means there's more crackpots associated with physics than with flying saucers. I'm one of the few with a foot in each camp, you understand. But anyway, the ones we're interested in are the unknowns, 21.5%. Gee, he said 3%. Now, don't tell me he was very poor at arithmetic. I got a bridge down near Brooklyn. I'd be happy to sell you. Up near Brooklyn, I guess. Even more important is this category called insufficient information. If there wasn't enough data available about a sighting, it was not listed as an unknown, which are the only ones we're interested in. It was listed as insufficient information. So Bova's stupid remark, and I sent him a copy of this statement, and he still insisted. It's just because there wasn't enough data. even though the study itself made clear that if there wasn't enough data, it was not an unknown. And I just ran across, well, as a matter of fact, the current issue of Sky and Telescope, beloved of amateur astronomers, has something about an approach to common sense about nonsense, in which he includes naturally flying saucers, or UFOs, and abductions and astrology, and he doesn't even know anything about astrology either, but that's another question. Even that repeats, well, the only reason sightings couldn't be explained is that there just wasn't enough data. When the definitions given in the report, and my column in the MUFON Journal, I strongly recommend the MUFON Journal because it runs a column by me every month, and lots of other good stuff. My next issue will have my column quoting the actual definitions and all that sort of stuff. I think I sold out both copies of Blue Book Special Report 14 that I had here, but I've got an order blank and you can get them. You don't need to believe anything I say. Go look it up for yourself. But this puts the lie to all those comments. And yet those kinds of comments are still being made, e's and abs. This is the May issue of Sky and Telescope we're talking about. So the pollution has come down through the ages. It's very hard to wipe out pollution, believe me. All right, let's look at the next slide. Oh, I mentioned they did a quality evaluation. All the sightings are by poor observers. Really? Gee whiz. The best sightings, the excellent cases, 35% were unknown. None of this 21% routine. Doubtful and poor, 15 and 18%. The better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. Just the opposite of what was said by these prominent scientists doing their thing. Their thing was spreading manure. Too damn lazy to do their homework. 4 rules for debunkers. And these apply in whatever field you want to use them. They're not restricted to ufology. What the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's a heck of a lot easier. This Sky and Telescope magazine talks about wackos and yahoos and cranks and nuts and so forth. The 4th rule is do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too damn much trouble. And so these techniques work, I'll guarantee you. You want to debunk anything. If you use these, you can do it without much trouble too. So the better the quality, the more likely to be an unknown, but you'd never know that. Incidentally, Blue Book Special Report 14 isn't mentioned in 13 different anti-UFO books that have been published, even though every single author was well aware of it. What the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them, you understand? Strange world we live in. Let's look at the next slide. Oh, only kooks and quacks believe in UFOs and wackos and all the rest of that. Well, here's some data, facts, you know, those things that we all forget about when we talk about flying saucers, naturally. Polls taken 66, 73, 78, 1987. Now, I didn't formulate these, I'm just quoting the results. Are UFOs real or imaginary? Well, way back, my God, almost 40 years ago, ratio of believers to non-believers was only 1.5 to 1. Now, the newspapers, of course, in their infinite wisdom, said only 46% believe, assuming that 54% did not. A little distortion there, there's a big difference. By 73, after we'd been to the moon 3 times, and yes, I believe we've been to the moon, absolutely. It was 1.8 to 1 believers over non-believers. By 78, it was better than 2 to 1. 87, we lost a little ground, only 1.6 to 1 believers over non-believers. Now, the debunkers have an explanation, and I've heard it. That's because all that tabloid nonsense, not only the newspapers, tabloid television shows, and all this kind of stuff, testable hypothesis. If that were true, then one would certainly expect that the greater the education, the less likely to believe in flying saucers, right? Presumably, the greater the education, the less likely to be influenced by the tabloids. Well, okay, testable hypothesis, and I used 78 data because they broke down the educational level of the respondents into 3 groups. These are adults with a grade school, high school, and college background. Now, with only a grade school background, it is true that the non-believers slightly outnumber the believers. Get a high school diploma and it's 2 to 1, better than 2 to 1, believers over non-believers. The shocker is that with a college background, it's almost 3 to 1, 66 to 23. The greater the education, the more likely to believe in flying saucers. I have lectured to well over 100 professional groups, engineering societies, sections of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, American Nuclear Society. Gee, I mean, you know, nice to have music, but that the rocket would have to provide all the energy. He never heard of cosmic freeloading. I'm a great one for cosmic freeloading. We use it all the time on all our deep space probes, and the Cassini spacecraft is heading towards Saturn right now as we speak. We launched it so it would go past Venus and get a free kick, and go from there past Earth and get another free kick, and go past Jupiter and get another free gravitational kick, be in the right place at the right time. When we go to the moon, we don't provide all the energy. We say, shoot the arrow into the sky and let the moon come along. Let's hope it's on schedule, and it usually is, and it will pull us in the rest of the way. Why should we provide the energy? That's more room for payload. All our deep space probes do that. Just like a skier, going downhill, let gravity do the work for you. He further assumed, one of his worst assumptions, he said, look, when you're coming back from the moon at 25,000 miles an hour, you better slow down. That's reasonable, I won't argue that. It's kind of tough to land at 25,000 miles an hour. Well, the only way you can do that, of course, is to fire a retro rocket. Turn the rocket around and fire some propellant, sort of stand on your tail, so to speak. Well, the only trouble with that is every pound of propellant you use at the end has to be launched from the Earth at the beginning, slowed down at the moon, launched from the moon, and then slowed down back here. That's kind of stupid. What do? We say, thank you, Lord, for giving us an atmosphere. It gives us something to breathe, which is kind of handy. And we can use it to slow down the rocket, as long as we're smart, not strong. Remember Apollo 13? You better get the angle correct. If it's too shallow, it's bye-bye Earth. If it's too steep, you dig a big hole in the ground. So being smart's more important than being powerful. I was never tall enough to be a really good basketball player. I was a good playmaker. So what I'm saying is the astronomers, they don't know what the heck they're talking about. When they calculate space travel, they're astronomically in error because it's something about which they know nothing. Well, can you get to the stars or can't you? Not on a bicycle, not with a dumb old chemical rocket. That's true. How many of you have computers at home? Desktops or laptops? Yeah, just about all of you. Now, I'll tell you something. You didn't know this probably, but those computers are not just using small vacuum tubes. They're not using slide rules. I was in a college class and I used the term slide rule, and then I realized I didn't know what I was talking about. Nobody in the class knew what a slide rule was. Anybody here know what a slide rule is? Yeah, okay. Friedman's law, passed by me and named for me. Technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. This laser pointer is not just a better light bulb, different physics. That nuclear rocket engine, what timing, is not just a better chemical rocket. I worked on this for Westinghouse. The reactor's inside here, the other end of the nozzle. 1,100 megawatts this is. That's about half the power of Grand Coulee Dam. It's this big. The test was run in 1968, not exactly last week. Now, Los Alamos tested one, a little bigger, this big, the Phoebus 2B. 4,400 megawatts, twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam, it was this big. So when President Bush said something about, we're thinking about the possibility of considering perhaps using nuclear energy, a little late, George. We tested them back in the 60s, out in Nevada, incidentally, not far from Area 51, or where they test nuclear weapons, and you really don't want to be there when they run the test. Let's look at the next slide. There's one in operation, just so you'll know. This is not Walt Disney, in other words, and you don't want to be close when it's running. You'd rather be underground or away. And you wouldn't use these to get off the Earth. This is not a launch vehicle. It's an upper stage, about twice as efficient as a chemical rocket. Is it the big deal for going to the stars? No, of course not. Nuclear fusion, worked on that, geez, I hate to admit this, 43 years ago. If fusion is the most important source of energy in all your lives, the sun is a fusion factory. It's not a mass of burning gas, as the great astronomers assumed it was 100 and some years ago. It's a fusion factory. If you use the right stuff in the right way, and there's no point in doing it if you don't, you can kick particles out the back end, that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in the dumb old chemical rockets. 10 million. Now, do I think aliens use fission or fusion? Of course not, because progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. Now, do you think they might have a head start on us? Well, the Betty and Barney Hill star map work tells us that those guys apparently came from Zeta 1, or planets around either Zeta 1 or Zeta 2 reticuli. Two stars that you can't see from here, got to go down the equator. Now, what's special here is those two stars are not only like the sun, should have planets. They're only 39 light years away, just down the street, and they're only 1/8 of a light year apart. They're more than 30 times closer to each other than the next star is to the sun. That means from a planet around one, you can see planets around the other one directly. You don't need to figure it out. Also, they just happen to be 1 billion years older than the sun. Some people say 3 billion, but you know I'm a very conservative guy, so I say only 1 billion years older than the sun. So one would expect that they have some knowledge about advanced technology that we haven't even dreamed about. And you know, I keep that in mind. When I started working in industry, everybody wanted a high-speed desk calculator. Could add, subtract, multiply, and divide. It was noisy, took a lot of power out of the wall, and cost $600. An extra $200, you could do square roots with it. Wow! And you can buy one for $5, you know, that does that and 16 other things. But not by using smaller gears and wheels and cogs. And that's in less than 50 years, for goodness sakes. So it's an exciting time to be alive, and the notion that you can't get here from there is nonsense. Flat and simple, and who says it the most? Astronomers. Are they experts on deep space promotion? They don't know a damn thing about it. It's truly incredible. Let's look at the next slide. Oh, remember the only shards of physical evidence are the Roswell newspapers. Well, this is the Chicago Daily News. Army finds air saucer on ranch in New Mexico. Dateline Roswell. This is evening paper, July 8th, 1947. Now, it didn't make it into the morning papers because the press release went out too late that day. So if you look for the New York Times, and every town seems to have the New York Times on microfilm. Well, I looked there, I didn't see anything. Of course you didn't see anything. No Eastern paper had this story, but I like, the next one's my favorite. Let's look at the next slide. And when do you see headlines like that? Evening paper, Los Angeles Herald Express, Sunset Edition, late racing results. Army finds flying saucer. General believes it is radar weather gadget. Air Force says platter picked up on ranch, and it goes all the way down to the bottom of the page. The article news was different back then. You didn't have CNN, et cetera, et cetera. Newspapers would get the story on the wire, would call the sources to get more information. The story grew all day long. But one interesting thing is all these stories say found last week. You wouldn't know that from the Air Force. They say it was found in early June, totally ignoring what the papers at the time said. That's so they can put it with a crazy explanation of a Mogul balloon, because there weren't any launched that they didn't find that could have fit this unless you go back a month. And then Dr. David Rudiak has shown it, even then it doesn't fit. But the only shard of physical evidence is the Roswell newspaper. Dreamer. But we already have the cover-up story, all in the same day. Story went out afternoon, went out on the wire. General Ramey, head of the 8th Air Force, which was over the 509th in Roswell, his adjutant, his chief of staff really, not adjutant, Colonel Thomas Jefferson DuBose, took the call from Ramey's boss, telling him, giving him 3 orders. And I got this directly from DuBose, standing this far apart. General McMullen said, I want the press off our backs. I don't care how you do it. I want you to send one of your Colonel Couriers up here today when some of that wreckage comes in. McMullen was in Washington. DuBose is in Texas, headquarters, 8th Air Force. The wreckage originated in New Mexico, was heading toward Fort Worth. And I don't want you ever to talk about it again, not even with your buddy Roger Ramey. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing? No, sir. When a 2-star general tells a colonel what to do, he does it. These were both West Pointers, so was Ramey. And people say, well, why didn't he ask questions? You don't ask questions. You're given an order, you follow it. I mean, this is 1947. We just had a little war before that, and these guys were all involved in the war. And as I say, they were West Pointers. So the wreckage comes in. General Ramey says, you don't say anything. Now, did Major Marcel argue? But General, I want to tell my story. No, he said, yes, sir. Very simple. He gave the explanation. Now, admittedly, the Air Force has admitted that that was a lie. In 1994, they admitted that, you understand. It took them a little while to get around to telling the truth. But the Air Force wouldn't lie, would it? You're damn right it wouldn't. It often did about flying saucers. Let's look at the next slide. This appeared on the 9th. They grabbed the rancher, brought him back into town, gave him a new story to tell, and Colonel Weaver, in his big fat Roswell report, quotes at length from this, but leaves out the last sentence, which is something like, if there's one thing I'm sure of, I'm never going to report a story again, but I'm sure it wasn't a weather balloon. That it gets left out. Well, disinformation, you got to put it out there, And this is the story which describes a bundle of sticks and other stuff. And we know from his son and from his neighbors, the rancher's son and neighbors, I did talk to his son. He wasn't alive when we started. I don't know how to reach them. I mean, there are some people who do, but not me. Baloney. They should set up a delicatessen in the Air Force for all the stuff they put out about flying saucers. Let's look at the next slide. Oh, this is the next day's paper. Well, in Alamogordo, which is in New Mexico. Fantasy of flying disc is explained here. So they put out the explanation, then they staged the launch of a radar reflector weather balloon combination and told the press that's what it was. Not a lot of people bought it. Newsmen watch Army radar crew launch disc in quotes, you understand. All three of these deal with that story. It was an intentional, flat-out lie. It was a real launch, but it had nothing to do with what people were observing. Major Marcel, in our first conversation, covered an area 3/4 of a mile long, a few hundred feet wide. Nothing conventional. No rivets, no wire, no vacuum tubes, no parachutes, no propellers, no jets, no nothing like that. Must have been an upper air explosion because there was no crater. When airplanes go in, they can dig an awful big hole in the ground. And Jesse had been on a plane that had crashed. He knew about such things. He was only the intelligence officer, and he's been viciously attacked, for the most elite military group in the world, the 509th, the only atomic bombers in the entire world. Obviously a nut. That's who you put in to work for those guys. Of course, we all know that. Let's look at the next slide. There's his son. Now, the Air Force claimed that they talked to all the people who had anything to do with this. They didn't talk to Jesse Jr. He's only a medical doctor, a flight surgeon, a pilot. He's a colonel in the reserve, just got called back in to go to Iraq, which shows how far down. He's 67 years old now, incidentally. And he got called back in because they're short of flight surgeons. But a great guy, and I think I'm the only guy who's been in his house and his father's house. He lives in Montana. And I just pray that he comes back in one piece. I think it's pretty desperate when you bring back a 67-year-old. I mean, and Jesse was in the reserve for a long time. It's not that he was objecting. I'm just saying that I think is off to the side. That's a damn shame. But the Air Force didn't talk to him. He handled wreckage in his living room. He's the one who gave us a good description of the I-beams, what the symbols looked like and all that. But obviously a nut. He's just a doctor and a pilot and a colonel in the reserve. Why should we trust him? He doesn't say what we want him to say, Next slide. There's that original picture that was in the papers. This is Colonel DuBose that I mentioned. When I talked to him, he was a retired general. General Ramey is holding a piece of paper here, which the Air Force says they gave to an agency, not named, but presumably the CIA, and they couldn't find anything on it. Isn't that amazing? Let's look at the next slide. You tell me there's no writing on there? No typing? I mean, you'd have to be half blind not to realize that those are words with letters in the English language. And Dr. David Rudiak has done a fine job. It talks about victims of the wreck and stuff like that. But there's nothing there, the Air Force tells us. I mean, it gets a little disgusting after a while. And was the first guy to get these pictures way back in '79. And at that time, the negatives hadn't been handled so much. Now lots of people have had reproductions made, and you can see scratches on the negatives and stuff. But anyway, another bunk item from the military. Let's look at the next one. Oh, there's Tommy DuBose. We had to cut some of what he did in a TV interview for us. It's in the Recollections of Roswell video. He was talking about some of the women on the base, and we didn't want that in the story. I'm not sure his wife would have liked to see it either, but he's gone now. But it took us to one of the best restaurants in the Orlando area. He was fully in control of his mental faculties, very sharp guy. He had 18,000 hours as a pilot, incidentally. Any pilots out there? Then 18,000 is quite a few hours. And he set up the Air Force's search and rescue team, and he gets categorized as some kind of a UFO nut. I mean, I resent that. I mean, I stood, as I said, right next to him. Let's look at the next slide. Sappho Henderson, her husband was Pappy Henderson. He handled wreckage. He flew some of it to Ohio, to Wright Field. He actually grabbed a small piece of the wreckage and handed it to a friend of his in 1978 who had to give it back and promised not to talk about it on his honor as a former naval officer, and he didn't until after the Unsolved Mysteries program ran. Leonard Stringfield had found Sappho, but he wouldn't tell me where she was, so I managed to find her, got her on the show, and after the show, people called. Only 28 million people saw the show the first time around, 1989 Unsolved Mysteries. And we got calls from all kinds of people who knew something. And then John Kromschroeder, Pappy's buddy, told her that he had told him. I talked to him, and Pappy had handed him a piece of the wreckage. He had to give it back, unfortunately. But if Pappy had a piece, other guys have pieces too. World War II guys took home souvenirs. Whether it was a Luger or a sword or whatever. So I'm looking for anybody else who's got a piece of wreckage. You can call me Collect anytime. New Brunswick, I'm the only Friedman in the book. But Sappho has been attacked. Her husband has been attacked. He's long since dead. But I talked to the guy who was World War II bombardier, and Pappy had told him the story too. Let's look at the next slide. I'm just skipping over some of this just so you have some idea. There's John Kromschroeder. He was a dentist, another unbelievable person, He's gone too, unfortunately. Next slide. The Air Force didn't talk to Sappho or John. Here's the big fat Roswell report. Fact versus fiction in the New Mexico desert. Colonel Weaver supplied the fiction, including having the cowboy, that looks like Mac Brazel's hat there. He never said he saw anything come down out of the sky. I mean, malarkey right from the start, literally. 1,000 pages of nonsense. Next slide. This is the Mogul Balloon explanation. Oh, another habit of Colonel Weaver. Be careful with his, that's in backwards. Hey, if you stand this way, maybe you can read that. Yeah, get on the other side of the screen, that'll do it. Turn it around. Anyway, this is a memo from the FBI in which they say that the wreckage was going to be sent up to Wright Field, and that at first it was thought it was like a balloon, but further telephonic conversation had not borne out this belief. He quotes from this, he doesn't show it, and he leaves out that had not borne out this belief, which turns the meaning around 180 degrees. If that isn't debunking, and I want to debunk the debunker, but that's typical, sorry about that, newest form of Chinese. But he doesn't show it, you see. He's got this big fat report, but he doesn't have room to show the actual memo. He should be strung up by his thumbs. Next slide. Oh, there's a Mogul Balloon bit of nonsense. Hey, on television, you will often see this huge polyethylene balloon in the Roswell story. Didn't exist before Roswell. They had all these little standard old weather balloons, 23, 25, it varied a little bit. But it looks very dramatic to have this huge polyethylene balloon. The nice thing about neoprene is it goes to dust in a few weeks. So if this thing landed in early June, it would have been dust by July. But the Air Force doesn't tell us that, you understand. And they don't tell us it was found last week. Well, what's a little lie between friends? Everybody knows. That's okay. Mogul, indeed. It was so classified that several of the launches were allowed to just come down to the ground and they didn't even track them down. It's the purpose that was classified, to make a constant altitude balloon that would hear the signals from a Soviet nuclear explosion should one occur. This is a 600-foot train of balloons. And it wasn't how we found out the Russians did their first test in 1949. That was with air sampling from airplanes off Asia. The winds blew the stuff out that way. Next slide, please. Oh, they said in that report that that was the last word. Well, so 3 years later, they put out another report. They lied again. Case closed. This one lies about me too. And this is the infamous report, which tells us that the problem about bodies being reported was all due to crash test dummies, which they'd been dropping all over the state. And they did all this incredible research and located where all those tests were conducted. But somebody asked at the press conference, Colonel, when did those drops occur? Well, 1953 and thereafter. Well, but didn't Roswell happen in 47? Well, people's memories get confused. That took care of that, you know. We have time travel for crash test dummies. They think we're the dummies. Now, furthermore, let's look at the next slide. This is the map that shows where there's little triangles on there. They use this map 3 times in that volume. The only trouble is that the 2 crashes were here and here, and there were no drops near there. It's as if they made an effort, make sure you don't drop anything where those saucers dropped, you know. But they use it 3 times. They think we won't look at the map. Even worse, let's look at the next slide. This is a crash test dummy, the one in the middle. Sierra Sam. Now, I talked to Mr. Madsen. He was an officer when he was retired colonel when I talked to him. He was in charge of the program. He was still alive, obviously, in New Mexico. He said, there's no way that could explain it. He said, look, Stan, for the test to be meaningful, ejection seats and things like that and getting out of a balloon, the crash test dummies had to be the same size and weight as pilots. They were 6 feet tall and 175 pounds. There's no way to get that down to a little guy this big. But why let the facts stand in the way of a good explanation? Let's look at the next slide. Oh, another lie. Joe Kittinger, one of the world's great pilots, he's the guy who was crazy enough to jump out of a balloon at 110,000 feet or something. He said, you know all those stories about 2 redheads or redheads being seen? And I was the guy who had heard the 2 stories. He said, that was me. There was an accident near the base, and one of the balloons, the basket tipped over, and one of the guys, we wound up with bad head injury at the base hospital, head all blew up and stuff. That was me. When did it happen? 1959. Now we got 12 years of time travel for crash test pilots. I mean, you know, this gets a little extreme. Next slide. Oh, Popular Mechanics joined the act. They explained it all. I did an article in UFO magazine about this. They had 3 major points, all of which were absolutely wrong. But why let the facts stand in the way of a good story? They said Frank Kaufman was at the middle of this right from the start, and it's been turned out that he wasn't telling the truth, so the story doesn't exist. And they declassified all these files, and there's nothing there, and they hadn't declassified anything. And Frank wasn't involved until 1991, and I started this in 78. That's a long period of continuous involvement from the start, except if we leave out the first 11 years. I mean, minor detail. And they found this box that they said explains it all. One of these radar reflector businesses. Let's look at the next slide. I think that's there. Yeah, and they made a big deal about it. It has nothing at all to do with it. This is indeed a radar reflector, but what's that got to do with what was found there? Nothing. But this is Popular Mechanics, and they just did another article. They had done a previous bad article, and they have a constant history of this. The interesting thing is, why do they do this? Because Roswell sells. And yet they accuse the town of Roswell of taking people for a ride, these people making gullible believers and stuff. The museum is free. They've had 1.3 million visitors. And if you're in Roswell, it's because you want to be there, because it ain't on the way to nowhere. It's 200 miles from Albuquerque, 200 miles from Amarillo, 200 miles from El Paso. Come on down in July. I'll be there speaking on July 1st. Great place, nice people. Even Walmart has a sign, welcome aliens, locals too. Next slide, please. Oh, Skeptic magazine last year was even worse. They show this picture. You notice the word Roswell, big type there? How a modest military adventure in 1947 was turned into a great whopper of a UFO tale in 1978. What they really should have said was how a modest UFO story, or how a modest military adventure was converted into a great whopper, or something like, no, the other way around anyway. But here's the crazy thing. Look at that fancy finished saucer stuck in the ground. Major Marcel, and they don't talk about the other crash site at all, talked about wreckage, small pieces of stuff strewn over an area. Does that look like wreckage? And you notice the sheep down below was a sheep ranch, and the military vehicles in the background for authenticity. This was written by a weatherman, a balloon expert, who got everything wrong, and I did a column about this. I mean, malarkey. But Skeptic magazine, what do you expect? Dr. Michael Shermer, he's the one who said he'd believe Roswell when somebody shows him a body. I'm sure he thinks there are no black holes because nobody's handed him a piece of a black hole, and so forth. Nobody's even seen one. They see the effects of one. But I love having Roswell up there in big print. Next slide, please. Oh, one of the things he said is that it isn't even mentioned in Ted Blocher's 1947 wave. Well, if you look in the darn thing, there's 2 paragraphs about it. It's mostly mistaken, but still, it's there. It isn't neglected. He didn't get all his facts right. Next slide. That's got over 840 sightings in it. Carl Flock has written the best of the miserable anti-Roswell books. There are several of them. Prometheus itself published 3 different anti-Roswell books. Methinks they doth protest too much. Now, Carl used the standard approach for debunking. He believes there are flying saucers, but there was no Roswell, no MJ-12. About Colonel Blanchard, he was just a loose cannon, just made up the story to gain attention and go out, become a big shot. He went on to be a 4-star general, incidentally. Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force when he died of a massive heart attack in the Pentagon. He had been Chief of Operations for SAC, with a few thousand megatons of nuclear weapons under his control. Had been Inspector General for the Air Force. Obviously a loose cannon, we all know that. I showed you the picture of Sappho Henderson, her husband. Well, he was known as a practical joker. What he was saying was he had a piece of a V2 when he was passing that off as part of a saucer. Well, he hadn't talked to his family. Of course, I had talked to his wife and his son and his daughter and his son-in-law. They had held the piece. Everybody knew about the piece of a V2. I mean, where do these guys get these things? They make them up out of whole cloth. And that reference, the source of information for he was a loose cannon down the bottom, an unnamed military officer. Carl himself was guilty of conducting a hoax a number of years ago. One wonders whether this isn't the same category. There are many other things wrong with the book, but let's go on to the next one. There's Colonel Blanchard. Let's go on to the next slide. Here's his obituary from the New York Times. Obviously a dink. They put every dink's obituary in the New York Times, a huge service out at the Air Force Academy where he was buried. I mean, Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force took 4 promotions after Roswell to get him there. Obviously a nut. I mean, that's the kind of guys we want at the top of the Air Force, Next slide. There's Walter Haut. Now, Joe Nickel, who's the big shot for SICOP, he's got 3 degrees, this Committee for the Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. All the degrees are in English, but he's a scientific investigator. We did a television show. I was in Roswell, he was in West Coast. And this story was all made up story by that PR officer. I said, don't you even know his name? Well, no. I said, well, I've been in his house many times. You're going to tell me that the public information officer, himself a bombardier during World War II, dropping lots of bombs on Japan, that he's going to make up a story for the elite group and not wind up in the brig? I mean, this is absolute nonsense. The only atomic bombing group in the whole darn world, and the PIO is going to make up a story to get attention. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier. You don't even need to know their name. You know, it's easy. Let's look at the next one. Walter's still alive. Oh, here's that book by Goldberg, Enemies, the Culture of Conspiracy in Modern America. Wow. Next slide, please. Don't want to waste too much effort on that. Oh, here's the Roswell in an earlier issue of Popular Mechanics. Nobody has ever described an alien who looked like this. Notice the nose, sexy lips there. Why'd they put it on the cover? It was their biggest selling issue of 1997 until Princess Di died. They're not giving away Time magazines. They are giving away admission to the museum in Roswell. Why let the facts get in the way of a lousy story? You know, next slide, please. There's my book, Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident. I do have some copies left. No charge for the autograph. You got to buy the book to get it. But next slide, please. Just a UFO picture, because I want to show you number 5. This is a series of 7 that were taken at Salt Lake City, Utah. That's the Mormon temple on the earlier picture. Next slide. I think this is an ionized air plasma related to a magneto-aerodynamic propulsion system, which does not carry along something which it throws away. Propellant, you know, works by interacting with the electrically conducting atmosphere, which you make electrically conducting by ionizing air. There's an electromagnetic submarine that was built in the mid-60s that worked. Same idea, seawater instead of ionizing air. I just show this because you haven't seen it before. Next slide. One of my favorite UFO pictures. All you see is spots of light at night, say the noisy negativists. Well, look carefully at this. This is Vancouver Island, British Columbia. I'll blow this up in the next slide. This was investigated by Dr. Richard Haynes, a NASA scientist. In the next slide, you'll see the blow-up of this. That's just a point of light at night, right? We got anything flying around like that in 1980? I don't believe it for a minute. And Dick Haynes, PhD, worked for NASA at Ames Laboratory, etc. Next slide. You want to know about Majestic 12? I'll talk about that a little tomorrow. We've got a few copies left. Next slide. The congressional hearings. Best paper is by Dr. James E. McDonald, professor of physics at University of Arizona. Remember, there's no data, but I've got a paper with Jim's 71-page testimony, 41 separate cases. Outstanding paper. But of course, you can't believe Congress anyway. We all know that in this area. So next slide, please. There's the Condon report. Turns out 30% of the 117 cases studied in detail could not be identified. It further turns out there's a whole chapter on government involvement in UFO investigations, and it never mentions Blue Book Special Report 14, which covered more than 20 times as many cases. And I know they know about it because I wrote Condon about it, and I got an answer acknowledging my letter. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. What the public doesn't know, we're not going to tell them. No room. It's only 965 pages. How could they mention the largest study ever done? Next slide. Oh, 2 other good sources. UFO evidence. This is the congressional hearings. Next slide. You can't see that, I know. So. Why don't you use the Freedom of Information Act, Stan? All you got to do is ask and you can get it. Took me a while to get that from the National Security Agency. That's their justification for withholding 156 UFO sightings. Well, you got to work harder, Stan. Well, I did, and look what I got in the next slide. Double action, you see. Well, they changed their mind. They started to put out more information. Let's look at the next slide. I'll be talking about these tomorrow. The NSA switched from blackout to whiteout. They didn't like my showing the blacked out documents on television, because you don't need to read anything. They released 156 UFO sightings, except you can only read 2 lines per page. All the rest is whiteout. And no pressman has jumped on this. And I've had people in ufology say, well, Stan, they're not covering up anything. I said, can you read what's beneath the white? Well, no, then they are covering up. Well, it's all sources and methods information. That's the standard excuse. 98% sources and methods, and it's listed under UFOs. That makes no sense. It's a lie, flat out, Incontrovertible lie. Let's look at the next one. Just to show you it wasn't just one page. I got over 156 pages like this. Very exciting. Next slide. Now, it took me 5 years to get this UFO document from the CIA. And they say, why don't you scrape off the black? I say, idiot, they Xeroxed it first. There's nothing underneath there. They're not stupid. And I applied many years later when there's a new change in the laws. Didn't get one more word declassified on this page. They got a sense of humor. They put out a page that says deny in toto. They couldn't find 8 lousy words to declassify on it like they found here. But they're not covering anything up. Incidentally, I'll talk about this tomorrow, but these were documents the CIA didn't find when it did its court-ordered search. The NSA admitted they had copies of these. So then I went to the CIA, and after 5 years and an appeal, I managed to get this. Very informative, but it does prove they're covering something up. I mean, unless you can make a big deal out of words like title and info date, stuff like that. Let's look at the next slide. This is another one, just so you know that that's not the only one like that. Next slide. Is that it? Good, okay. Let me summarize all this business that, as I said at the beginning, there's no way to cover all the misinformation, disinformation, debunk nonsense that you will find everywhere you look, on the History Channel, no less. Go to my website and you'll find a 3-page letter I wrote to History Channel about how they fouled up on Roswell. The point is there are facts, there are data. If we're going to stand up and talk about flying saucers, let's work from the evidence. That's the scientific approach. It's the journalistic approach. And certainly it ought to be the scientific approach. And if you're going to express supposedly a professional opinion from a publicly appointed pedestal because one is Professor so-and-so, Dr. so-and-so, Editor so-and-so, one has an obligation to know what you're talking about or to shut up. Personal opinions we're all entitled. Professional opinions are supposed to require knowledge and ethics, something sadly lacking in the noisy negativist pronouncements from on high. So yes, there's a lot of bunk out there. I thank you for listening. Come back tomorrow over in A, and we can have some questions and answer here today. Thank you. Thank you.